Hello. Hello. And welcome to today's Fellows Colloquium. Professor Gates says hello. He's watching us from London, where he is there to receive an honorary award, and he'll be with us next week and say hello in person. We are excited to have Gbemisola Abiola speak today. And before she does, Professor Daniel Abiboah will be providing an introduction. Please welcome him.
Thank you, and you got the pronunciation all right. It's a pleasure to get to introduce Dr. Gbemisola Abiola for the first time as a doctor. She's an anthropologist who has just defended a very gritty thesis on people internally displaced by the Boko Haram insurgency in northeast Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. And I believe this is your first formal talk as a doctor. Gbemisola is a migration, internal displacement, human security, and counterterrorism researcher with a regional focus on West Africa. She has been a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and an international security fellow at the Belfer Center. Gbemisola has also been a Harvard Horizons Scholar, where she presented her work to the Harvard-wide community. In a Boko Haram literature still dominated by conspiracy theories and journalistic accounts, Dr. Abiola has spent significant time on the ground interviewing displaced persons who get by in an atmosphere of terror, one that is dominated by institutional and infrastructural voids. She has walked in the shoes of displaced persons caught in the crossfire between Boko Haram and military repression, and her account takes their voice, lived experience, coping strategies, and ordinary affect seriously. Indeed, her study of displaced persons invites us to reconfigure the margins of insurgency, to see, to feel with, and recognize the precarious agency of the displaced and dispossessed in war. Finally, it was from Gbemisola that I first learned that there was a thing in Harvard called the Dazzler. Apparently, this is a Harvard letter-headed introductory letter, signed and sealed from the highest places, that doctoral students take to the field and which apparently works like magic and opens doors. Gbemisola never joked with the Dazzler. She always made time for the Dazzler. So in many ways, Gbemisola, I think you are now the embodiment of Harvard's Dazzlers, and long may you dazzle in the spotlight of success.
Thank you so very much. I don't feel like I should continue, like the halo on my head. Woo! Thank you so very much. And thank you to every one of you who's taken the time to attend this presentation. I genuinely appreciate your time and your presence here. So I will be starting this presentation. There's a bit of some technical situation going on here, so just bear with me as I use two laptops. Does this capture the volume? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. All right. Okay, I don't need to look back. It's right in front of me. Okay, brilliant. So to begin, I would like to establish 3 cardinal points and takeaways for this talk that would help us situate how Japa meets Blaxit. Oh, thank you. All right, brilliant. How Japa meets Blaxit. This would help us to have a fair understanding and to, of what this paper is all about. So first, I will walk us through the context within which the study emerged while providing a definition of terms. Second, we will interrogate what deep tiredness means and what emancipation means for both Africans and African Americans. This does not quite situate this. I would still use this, I guess. Okay. Okay. Do I just move the cursor to the left and right? The arrows left and right? Right? Left and right? Yeah. Okay. Like so? Yep. Okay. All right. So you have in front of you a vision of what I'm trying to do. So At least I don't have to repeat that. And then third, we will examine how social media platforms and virtual Black enclaves circulate ideas of Black liberation in other geographies and how this created new virtual communities and ecosystems for Black nouveau émigrés. A quick caveat here. This is a work in progress. Given this, I would be very happy to receive your feedback on areas that may need further interrogation. The formulations of this study became firmly grounded during my PhD study here at Harvard. I studied internal displacement, as you have heard Professor Gbemisola mention, in northeast Nigeria, where I undertook a comparative ethnographic study of the impact of internal displacement caused by Boko Haram and how new structures of social and economic life, that is, tools of practical future building, emerge and evolve. My findings informed larger questions on migration within and across national borders and how everyday Black people navigate the precarity of displacement. However, the origins of this study began in 2015. At the time, the concepts and terms, Japa and Blaxit, barely made a dent as a social phenomena which required urgent attention. However, Japa and Blaxit are not entirely new concepts. They have existed historically and contemporarily as existential responses to real and perceived danger. The term Blaxit may give you an inkling into what Japa may mean, but to clear all your doubts, I will present an explanation of the terms. Japa is actually two Yoruba words conjoined. On its own, ja could mean to flee or to leave, but when accompanied by other words such as ita, meaning outside, its connotation far outweighs its literal meaning. Hence, to jasita, which literally denotes taking flight from a confined space or place into an open space outside, connotes the act of going astray. I think I skipped this here. Okay. Connotes the act of going astray. In other words, the person to whom the phrase jasita is directed or described is considered wayward, loose, and an out-and-out profligate. And when the quintessential Nigerian aunties use it to describe anyone, and I'm trying to embody that, that individual is conferred the full weight of their judgment and to the nth degree. So when pa is added to ja by young Nigerians, they use it to establish the determinedness, resoluteness, and in some ways the finality of ja. Hence, Japa conveys meanings of escape from Nigeria and indeed Africa's economic hardships. And it is a trope about flight that denotes running swiftly away from certain danger or to determine a course of action, or to terminate, I beg your pardon, a course of action and to remove oneself speedily from definite harm. Of course, Brexit, from which the word Blaxit was coined, dates back to 2010, following the then Prime Minister David Cameron's promise to organize a referendum upon re-election of his government. Fast forward to 2016, the referendum was conducted, resulting in 51.9% of Brexit, of the electorate voting to leave the EU. Unexpectedly, and some may argue disastrously, the Brexit referendum became a long-drawn campaign of negotiations and blustering rhetoric about the benefits that would accrue to Britain following its exit from the EU. The protracted deliberations yielded, for some, far less returns than it promised, making many people who voted to leave vehemently reconsider their choices. The derivative Blaxit may not quite embody the urgency of Japa, but it definitely possesses a similar semantic weight. Coined by Ulysses Burley III, he set up the word as a facetious comedic take on incessant incidents of police brutality, notably occurring between 2014 and 2016. In response to the psychological, emotional, and cultural impacts these incidents were having on African Americans, and this in relation to the general indifference or the often a hypothetical event of a mass exodus of African Americans from Africa to other places. For me, bringing together these terms or social phenomena in dialogue was an imperative. Following the police shooting of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Michelle Couture, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, Eric Garner, Janisha Fonville, Freddie Gray, Alan Sterling, and Philando Castile, all occurring between 2014 and 2016, I paid attention to how my African-American sisters, friends, colleagues, and associates navigated such harrowing incidents of brutality and the tripartite, earth-shattering pain, resentment, and resignation that encompasses the knowledge that full justice will not be attained. Of course, this torturous reality reached a crescendo following the brutal and brazen murder of George Floyd. Thereon, the refrain of deep tiredness became more verbalized and amplified. And this, of course, is in the larger context of the effects of micro and microaggressions that African Americans have suffered. The point here is not to relieve this trauma, but to signal that the forces that gagged and censured people's open expression of frustration about the structural, cultural, and systemic forms of racism took leave, albeit temporarily, and people could boldly say that they were not okay. The word tired became a common refrain. African Americans were not only forced to watch acts of senseless and brutal murder, they were also expected to carry on with life the next day like something earth-shattering had not just happened. In that moment, the clock stopped, and the people could say, I am not okay. I am tired of being tired. Simultaneously, also, economic hardships, insecurity, political instability, and police brutality across the continent inspired many of Africa's youth to aspire and indeed take actionable steps to relocate to Europe or North America. For many who may not have the means to emigrate through established channels, they took the perilous journey and routes to emigrate, and many of them getting trapped in deserts or swallowed up by the seas. And not only young men made this journey, so did young women and children too. The State Fragility Framework indexes how a state's failure to guarantee basic security to its citizens, maintain the rule of law and justice, or provide public good, results in the prevalence of humanitarian crisis, persistent social tensions, violence, or a legacy of armed conflict and mass emigration of citizens. This index, in fact, is the very essence of international development, and the entire ecosystem it generates hinges on principles such as poverty and corruption across Africa, as if this were a sole preserve of African states. While many studies and scholars cite these reasons as the determinants for immigration, I look at the refrain of young Africans following momentous events. These events resulted in seismic shifts in the zeitgeist across Africa. Notably, in West Africa, particularly in Nigeria, we witnessed the impact of EndSARS, among other similar mobilizations across Africa. So some of the incidents that occurred were not obviously occurring in isolation. COVID hit and the world was forced to shut down. The economies of many African countries were profoundly impacted and foundationally transformed by the effects of the pandemic. Nevertheless, beyond the everyday frustrations that accompanied quotidian existence, what had shifted was not so much the philosophy of hardship. That had been mastered even to the point of an art form, some may argue. Rather, what had established or what had become established was that the philosophy of hardship became firmly entwined with a deep sense of ennui. What had settled in the aftermath of incidents of state high-handedness and state-sponsored violence was a sense of listlessness, despair, enervation, demoralization, and weighty hopelessness encapsulated in the Yoruba phrase, otisumi, an expression of deep tiredness. For me, then, seeing this connection between deep tiredness expressed by both Africans and African Americans was a phenomenon and reality that needed to be unpacked. I define deep tiredness as the overarching or all-encompassing mental, psychological, emotional, and physical exhaustion that comes from being ensconced in systems of oppression, the exhaustion that derives from bearing the weight of such indignities, and the impacts of random and calculated acts of physical and economic violence with little to no promise of a change of the current structure, requiring only an act of escape. Other scholars have discussed this form of deep tiredness. Mary Frances Winters, in her seminal work, Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit, discusses what Black fatigue is. She states that Black fatigue is the pain and anguish of living with racism every single day of your life. It is about being fatigued by those who are surprised and express outrage with no action that such inequities still exist. It is about the constant fatigue of not knowing whether you or your loved one will come home alive. It is about enduring the ravages of intergenerational racism. Nicole Hannah Jones' 1619 project inadvertently hints at the origins of deep tiredness or Black fatigue in its re-examination of the legacy of slavery. While Black fatigue speaks to the overwhelming impact of racism, Petit and Rauschenberg, in their paper, Migration as Hope and Depression, Existential Immobilities in and Beyond Egypt, capture how tiredness, or deep tiredness, figures as a reality of young Africans. Echoing studies by scholars like Apadurai, Honwana, and Hage on stockedness, waithood, involuntary mobility, and forced mobility, they state that youth across the world are being thrust into periods of prolonged waiting or stockedness. By this, it is meant that people experience a sense of existential immobility or hopelessness as they are unable to move forward within normative systems of value. That is, to become adults and obtain what they may think their class status deserves. On the one hand, globalization, they continue, urbanization, technological advancements or advances, and expanding access to education create aspirations for lives previously not envisioned, while the entrenchment of meritocratic ideals promote the cruel notion, in quotes, that those aspirations are accessible, yet on the other hand, austerity, neoliberal economics, and political instability make those aspirations harder to achieve. In these circumstances, many people aspire to migrate in order to overcome a sense of being stuck in life. However, as borders intensify and visa restrictions and regulations become stricter, migration is not easily achieved. Moreover, even if achieved, life after migration is still marked by intense experiences of stockedness as a result of racialized labor and citizenship regimes in destination countries. Now, this is where I might need the help of the technical people because I want to show a video on my laptop, which will give you a sense of where I'm going with this. Hold on. Yeah.
Just wait till I'm back there to unmute you.
Unmute? Okay. All right, so I would like us to watch this clip for a bit. My sound? It's on.
Okay, I need to go to your settings to make sure it's coming out of here.
Okay.
Sorry.
make it louder or something? Okay.
Running sharply in it.
Sorry,
Okay.
let me get you back plugged in here.
No, don't worry, I'll help you. Thank you. Oh wow, it's the same thing. All right, let's just watch it without the this one at least.
I know what's happening. It wants to go out the video cable, so I just...
Should I take this out maybe?
No, leave that in for now. I just need to switch it over to here. Well, as
Where?
soon as
Later, bro.
it's going to switch, so
Oh.
we can just leave it in for 1 second.
Hey, Mr. Data Man. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. You know what it is. Alpha, I know you.
I need to switch it while that's plugged in.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
My entire
Yeah, I can't do much about
such
it.
a
Sorry.
mess.
You get unlimited data, just extra 40.
Okay, continue. You can enlarge it out. Sorry about that.
No problem, no problem. Baby, the money. Thank you. Just do a transfer. I don't need to go with your card. I'm all dressed up so I can go. Okay, I just received it. Thank you. Love you. Bro, that app, you forgot to cancel it though. We need the money, oh. We need it. AB of UK, half an hour, bros. My people, I just want to ask you, I beg.
Okay. All right. This kind of gives us a sense of what I'm trying to say. Thank you. So why then is this significant? Whereas the systems of oppression are indifferent and even arguably less dominant or permeating in the African context, the fact is that the impact, which I argue is the same. Deep tiredness or black fatigue are representative of the effects that said systems have created on the mind and body of both Africans and African Americans. The question then is, what does emancipation for both Africans and African Americans look like? Another video. Should I just move it permanently, perhaps? Maybe that's what I'll do.
It's just, you know, your slides are on here. So if you want to look
Keep
at your
doing
slides
that.
again, then we have to switch it back.
Okay.
And then we're probably going to have to redo the settings again once I put
Hold
this.
on, hold on. Because I need to figure out what the video is. 1 second. This is where the video is. Yeah.
Cora, will you come? Cora, will you come? It is past time.
I think
to
it's
go.
going. Thank you.
There is nothing here but suffering.
Oops, sorry about this.
Cora, will you come with me? It is past time to go. There is nothing here but suffering, pain, and suffering.
You're wrong about me, Caesar. You think I'm some kind of luck because my mama got away? But you're wrong. You're wrong. I ain't no kind of luck.
I'm not supposed to be here.
But I ain't.
Okay. I think I'll just stick to this, and then finally we could play it on my system. Thank you. The words of the character reflect those discussed by Malcolm X. He captures the sense of displacement in his seminal 1964 speech titled "The Ballot or the Bullet." Here he says that being born here in America does not make you an American. Why, if birth made you an American, you wouldn't need any legislation, you wouldn't need any amendments to the Constitution. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. The video, I argue, shows the tension that exists between those who are either by force of circumstance or pride of conviction, choose to remain in their homesteads, and those for whom escape is the only option. This does not signal a minimization of the effects of deep tiredness. That's not what I'm trying to say here. That is the effect of deep tiredness on the former. But rather, it is to show that the response of Black people to any phenomenon is not singular. Perhaps without realizing or articulating it in this way, the varying approaches are articulated by people who intuitively understand that voluntary uprootment unsettles and reorganizes migrant life, and that physical landscapes configure cognitive experiences. I argue that the mindset is largely being reshaped, and there are many people leaning towards the idea of Black migration is beginning to become a moment that we should pay attention to. There arguably, in my opinion, is a rebirth of the Black migration, or the Great Northward Migration, where 6 million African Americans migrated out of the rural southern United States to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and the West between 1910 and 1970. It is also reminiscent of the era of the mass exodus of many Africans to Britain and the Americas to escape despotic military rule from the 80s to the late 90s. Contemporarily then, there is a growing number of Black immigrants who feel politically targeted, economically stifled, and in some ways culturally powerless, and who aspiring to or literally Japaing or Blaxitting abroad to escape deep tiredness. And some of the people are not people you would guess. Stevie Wonder puts it rightly in his interview with Oprah about his decision to relocate to Ghana. stating that I don't want to see my children's children have to say, oh, please like me, please respect me, please know that I am important, please value me. What is that? Of course, there is much to unpack about the changing mindset, but if we are to briefly set aside the revolutionary and political impetus of Black liberation, I posit that the kernel of emancipation for both African Americans and Africans is a life lived in dignity, a life unencumbered by the minutiae of everyday oppression. The approach to accomplishing this just happens to be different. An interesting note is that on the flip side of Japa, there are young Nigerians who were either born in the US or have lived abroad, or should I expand it, young Africans who were either born in the US or have lived abroad for most of their life, are in some ways returning to Africa. Like many African Americans who are leaving also for Africa in pursuit of careers in sports, tech, or entertainment, these young African Americans, realizing that the enchantment of America has faded, find that it is easier for them to thrive in their home countries as representatives of their home countries. For me, this is where the connection between Japa and Blaxit gets interesting. Both Africans and African Americans are creating migrant virtual life worlds. What do I mean by this? By this, I mean that people are creating virtual communities using social media platforms to circulate information about migration across different geographies. While some of these virtual communities continue to bridge the information gap between Africans and African Americans, others focus on their catchment communities to circulate information about immigration. The ecosystem that this generates, I argue, produces the economics of the continuum of migration that is propelled by the quest for Black emancipation. The culture, for instance, of remittances to families for Africans signals the idea that a person has attained to that level of dignity wherein they can live without the thought, without being encumbered by the minutiae of oppression. And so we find that programs like the Year of Return instituted by the Ghanaian government that offer a spiritual and birthright journey to the global African family is generating travel guide businesses run by Africans and African Americans. And all of them are targeting would-be African and African American immigrants. Now, I'm putting these pauses so you would understand that I'm referring to first-gen Africans who are African Americans, but their parents are Africans, as well as African Americans who have been here generationally. Thus, this paper for me spotlights the emergence of virtual communities of nouveau immigrants. My goal is to expound on the symbolism and the affect of Black freedom through flight. Also, the study is somewhat self-interested because while COVID was in sway and there were several different platforms where conversations about the Black experience are discussed, there are certain circles that provide opportunity for conversations that exclude, that situate the Black experience only within one context. So for me, this study is somewhat self-interested as it aims to stand as a partial response to these forums that encourage short-sighted discussions about the Black experience as an isolated and differentiated experience with no reference to the possibility of its universality. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
I have a question that you did not discuss in your research, but I'm sure you know. What was the combined economic potential or growth that happened with the year of return to Ghana?
The combined. What do you mean by combined, if you don't mind asking?
Africans and African Americans on both sides were benefiting.
Right.
And I know individuals that spent $20,000 going. How much money was made?
I honestly wish I could answer that question on the amount of money that was made. Please.
So what I heard from the person that was the spokesperson for the Ministry of Tourism in Ghana at the time is that they made about $2 billion.
$2 billion?
Yeah. So they made about $2 billion from the money they were able to generate. So this included the visa, because people had to buy for visa, then housing, the festival. There was Afro Nation. There was a series of events that were happening in Ghana at the same time. So that was quite a significant amount of money. As I have the mic, I may...
Does that answer your question, or do you want me to...
That's what the government made, but that's not even counting.
No. But so this is, so basically that person, she was the spokesperson for the Ministry of Tourism. And so she was working with the Ghanaian government to communicate about the year return. And so she took part to a conference and she was actually mentioning that number. And so this was basically around the 2nd of January of 2020. So they knew the number already at that time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think so first, congratulations for your presentation. It was very informative.
Thank you.
What I would say is that we're very familiar about the idea of flight, because like you mentioned, in the 80s, 90s, it was very common for Africans on the continent to move abroad for safety, security, because of the economic hardship that were happening at that time with the structural adjustment policy. But I think what is interesting would be to expand more on the question of Africans, I say Africans, the big A, that return on the continent, not necessarily from a place of flight, or because I think flight as well, to me, there's a sense as well, you give up on something, and you live by in spite, or you live without, it's not like a positive, it's not an optimistic, hopeful movement. But you have Africans on the continent, in the diaspora, and as well in the larger African diaspora that want to go back to the continent from a very different type of mindset. They're not fleeing anything. Often they are, I guess having one thing about the people that were coming during the year return, a lot of them were middle class or upper middle class. So this was a very, it was not a situation of people being in any kind of hardship, at least financially. And so I think that part is very interesting. What I noticed, because I was in Nigeria during the NSAR protests, it was a very challenging time. But what I noticed is that the people that tend to leave afterwards tend to be people that are either working class, aspiring middle class, so people that are doctors, that just starting to have a situation for themselves, and they want to be financially stable. But what I noticed is that the people that are middle class and upper middle class tend to stay, and usually they're people that studied abroad, and so sometimes they have dual citizenship, so they have the possibility, if they choose to relocate outside of Nigeria, they tend to stay. And the other thing that I find is interesting is Africans that move across the continent, so that immigrate to Kenya, to South Africa, to Ghana, to other African countries. So yeah.
Thank you so very much. Okay, so I would say this. I'll preface what I'm about to say with this statement. So while I was thinking about this work, and obviously there's still, for me, being an anthropologist, there's a lot of ethnographic work that I need to sort of do to get the meat of the data that would enable this paper to be rich in quality. However, while I was thinking about this, I was thinking about all the different, almost like my brain was working like, you know, all these networks, and I was thinking about all the arrows pointing in different directions. And while I was thinking about these things, I thought to myself that there is indeed that return, which I sort of hinted at, about Africans who, you know, were either born here and are returning home so that they can be true representatives of their country, because they're no longer enchanted by the idea of America. Nevertheless, this is where I think I would, you know, put in a slight correction. The idea that only working class or aspiring middle class people are leaving. That's not true. At least I can cite examples of people who are either directly or indirectly close to me, who are leaving the continent. These are people who are wealthy. This is not like, they are wealthy by Nigerian standards, by African standards, by global standards. They are wealthy. They have their own houses, lots of property across different parts of the world, but they would still choose to uproot themselves and their family. And if they would tell you, they would say, I am leaving simply because of my children. You never know, whatever it is you do, you make all these investments. Ultimately, it's about your kids. Or you hear them make statements like, you know, leaving for me is become an imperative because at the end of the day, Africa can happen to you. So there are people who would still leave regardless of their economic buoyancy.
But I would say these people have always left. You know.
Right. Well, there's a fact to it. I agree with you. I'm not disputing this. This is just a pushback between the ideas that you're presenting and the ideas that I have to contend with, right? Because ultimately, whatever it is that I would have to establish within the paper has to be defended by the data. And the data I cannot yet produce, obviously, because this is a work in progress, as I have stated. However, what I feel, or what I have sort of, you know, preliminarily collated, is the idea that people who are upper class, people who are middle class, people who are rich, there are varying differences why they leave. Some of them indeed have dual citizenships already, and they find that it's easy for them to be international citizens everywhere it is that they go. Those are in a different category by themselves. And for some of them, you hear them say things like, you know, moving to the US actually, you know, it dipped my standard of living, because I lived much better than I did back home. Yes, you know, but they can travel and they can come back because of the passport privileges, which some who perhaps may have been wealthy too, their parents perhaps did not think about the idea of resettling in any of these Western countries, and so they do not have these passport privileges. They figured, like, since my parents did not make this journey on my behalf, I should do so for my children. So my children don't look back and say, but you had the means, why didn't you do this for us? Do you see what I'm saying? So, I mean, like I said, ultimately, the data would enable me to define these things appropriately, classify them and categorize them. But I genuinely appreciate your comment and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. This is something that I'm interested in, so obviously I would love this. I have a couple of comments. I don't think this should be a paper. I think it should be a book, because there are so many there are so many great ideas that you touch on, and I think, yeah, a paper would just really not allow you to do what you need to do and address all the different elements. I think one of the elements that I think you should speak about is the topic of youth, and I think it relates to what he's saying, that the assumption is that those who move are young people, but it's actually across all groups. Young people don't always have the money to move, and so it actually doesn't make sense to always assume that they're moving. They are moving because they can go study, but the majority of people are people who actually have finances. And I think it will be interesting to think about who in the US is moving. Is it young people? Is it those that can afford to move? And also, I think what is also interesting about your work is the fact that people are moving based on information that they're getting on social media. So I know Nairaland there's a lot of information on Ireland, but what spaces or social media platforms do you find are like very active when it comes to these virtual communities that you're interested in? And so that's why I'm like, I don't know if this is a paper because there's just so much. And then I think the last point for me that you should consider, and just listening to you, I thought, this is really brilliant. I mean, yeah, it's really great, is this notion that what's happening with Blaxit and Japa, is that what you say? Yeah, Japan, it's the notion that there's nowhere to go. There's no place for us to go to, because you can't go to Africa assuming that Africa is going to solve all your problems, but you can't go to America or Europe assuming. So what exactly is the problem? And I feel that those who are engaging in Blaxit or Japan are actually telling us that it's the global economy that is the problem. And I think that question is really, really important to explore, how people are engaging with these kinds of questions online. And instead, like, what does this kind of movement, because people have been moving. I mean, African Americans have been going to Africa, you know, forever, and the other way around too. But what about this moment do we get to understand something else other than Africa is terrible or America or Europe is terrible? Like, the grass is not always greener on the other side. What are we really getting to understand through your work? And I think that's why I'm like, a paper just wouldn't do it. Yeah, thank you.
Wow. Would it be wrong to say I shared the same sentiment? Because the more I thought about it, the more these ideas, you know, kept erupting in my mind, and the more I explored social media, you know, spaces, I began to think more and more of, you know, this as a possibility. But of course, in the world where real things have to happen, I still have my dissertation, which I feel like I need to do some work on, you know, as a published piece. And so I was thinking perhaps I should be less ambitious with this paper. But the more I work on this, it excites me because it's a moment that I think needs to be captured. On your question about, you know, the assumption that it is only young people who are leaving, you are correct. It's not just young people who are leaving, but I think that it is, perhaps it's also partly the fixation on youth that sort of front faces these conversations that, you know, sort of enables or sort of inspires the idea of focusing on young people in this paper in the interim, right? And so, you know, the idea that just young people are leaving is actually incorrect. There are many more people in their 50s, even in their 60s, who are leaving the continent, and en masse. There was this tweet I saw a couple of months ago when I was still, you know, engaging in Twitter before I had to like thoroughly focus on my work and not be sidetracked by social media. I saw this tweet that somebody made, and they said, to me, I felt that it was a little harsh, the statement. Nevertheless, they said that they alluded to this particular consultant, a doctor who's a consultant, who apparently had achieved the epoch of his career in, I believe, maybe Cameroon or Nigeria. I'm not exactly sure. I can't remember. But this individual had become a consultant, etc. But now they, according to the tweet, had moved, relocated to, as it were, go and study in a university or an institution to learn a different field of medicine. This is an individual who's maybe in their 50s or perhaps approaching their 60s, and for whom one would, you know, imagine that they would be thinking about retiring and sort of, you know, or whatever else. But the sort of engagement that inspired was, what is actually happening that is making people of this age group, this particular, you know, generation, move from this, even after all their attainment, why are they leaving? And just like you said, they're the ones who have the money and the means to do so. And this also references the idea of young people being youths in waiting, because they're perpetually in this state of stockedness that I have referenced. And so I think that And that's me speaking generally now. I'm not saying that there aren't avenues for young people. Tech has opened doors for many young people on the continent, where a lot of young people do not even feel the need to leave the continent at all. And they would instead get jobs where they would earn in foreign currency and live on the continent where they don't have to pay astronomical taxes. And they still have their social network, their support group, and all those things that make them African. They don't have to dissociate themselves or uproot themselves from these different economies. And so there is something to study about why that is happening to that generation of Africans as well. When you say that, how people are engaging with this question online, there is a plethora, I think, of skits, of conversations that are being had online about emigrating to wherever. You would hear people say, it's time for you to emigrate to Finland. It's free. You can emigrate to Finland. It gives you XYZ, XYZ. You would hear even African Americans would say things like, you can emigrate to Scotland, Stockholm, because Stockholm has all of these things that make African American life easy. They don't have to think about the idea of racism every single day of their lives. And of course, these things are not perfect. And like you've said, it sort of signals or points to the idea that where exactly, when Japa meets Blaxit, where exactly is that space where Black people can indeed live totally and completely free of these global economic structures that regardless of your attainment, regardless of your whatever it is that you've accomplished, you are still sort of circumscribed within those structures. And so, yes, indeed, there are many things that this in itself on its own is a paper or a chapter. So I understand what you mean.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abiola. Beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
So, hi, it's your friendly neighborhood clinical psychologist, always here to drop a few things.
Yes.
And you opened the door to a psychological term when you talked about fatigue. And I wanted to invite you then to think about migration in different ways, because certainly what we've seen in this Blaxit perspective here is that young Black people are leaving this earth. They are taking their lives at rates that are double what they have been. They are leaving a state of presence when they are taking substance at different rates because of the racism that they're experiencing. It's really only in that lens that discrimination exacerbates the rate at which young people are taking substances. So when you're talking about leaving or flight, that's already been brought out, thinking about what it means to flee when you may not believe that there's a place for you to go. So I think just to trouble the water a bit, you're certainly talking about the places meeting, right? Japa and Blaxit meeting. But what is it why might we see differences in what young Black children are doing to vacate, to flee, to fly, to cope with this in a different way? And is it because they either don't have the resources or the belief that there is a place for them to go and to be welcomed? So I just wanted to offer that as an invitation in this psych space. I'm always happy to thought partner with you on that.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much, Rihanna. Honestly, this was, even though I didn't frame it this way in my study, it was a little difficult for me to contend with, because this is pain, this is trauma. And I think, obviously because of the work that I have done, that I did rather in my dissertation, where I have focused for quite a bit on violence and the impact of violence, I think there's something, perhaps a sort of reactionary, a visceral reaction, perhaps, against the idea that I wanted to sort of sit on the impact of violence or the impact of pain or trauma. Nevertheless, obviously, just because I want to ostrich my way through this study in the interim does not mean that it's not something to consider, to deal with very thoughtfully and to address or even study it as a separate thing altogether. It's interesting that you mention how there are statistics and data showing or signaling that there are young African Americans who are unaliving themselves to escape this sense of listlessness and ennui. I would say that this is where I'm saying that Japa meets Blaxit, or Japa meets Blaxit, because in a similar way you have stories of young Africans stowing away in the tires of an airplane or in a boat, you know, hoping that the next place they would land would be somewhere in America. I mean, there was a case that happened, I believe maybe about 2 years-ish ago or 3 years ago. No, COVID, actually, I would have said let's forget the year of COVID, but we can't because I have to count back the years. So maybe let's say before COVID, right? Where this young Nigerian teenager, barely 14, I believe, stowed away in an airplane. Thankfully, it was just a trip between, I believe, Lagos and Abuja, perhaps, maybe like a 35-minute trip. So it didn't cause any physiological damages to his, you know, to him. And so in that kind of scenario, what inspired him to leave and be like, it's time for me to determine my own future by myself because this is my opportunity to flee? The fact that the danger of subjecting his body to that potentially dangerous and, dare I say, suicidal mission of escape is deeply unsettling, right? And I imagine that it's the same sort of way in which, obviously, people who are born here generationally may not aspire to stow away in, you know, the tires of a plane or whatever that contraption under the tire is called. But the means or the method becomes the utilization of substances or the abuse of substances. So for me, that's what I'm trying to say, that Japa meets Blaxit in the sense that the feeling of ennui, hopelessness is the same. The approaches that is taken is just different. Yeah.
So thank you for that. I really was curious to hear how you were going to draw these two migrations into conversation with one another. And I hear you talking about data. So I am but a humanist. So my comments are drawn from more kind of contextual or theoretical insights or questions that might or might not be useful to you. So two things. One is thinking about, I hear you using the language of enchantment, right? When people are thinking about their relationship to the state, for example, or to the country in which they were born, some kind of enchantment or expectation around citizenship rights and things. My sense is that, particularly if there's some focus in your work around younger generations, my sense is that people don't feel lied to. They feel as though they've been born into a dystopia. Like, it's not a lie. They recognize it for what it is, right? Which is very different than having some kind of expectation of rights that then have failed them. So I want to hear you think aloud a bit about that. And then secondly, which is a bit of a challenge, is to think about your language of liberation as mobilized between these communities, right? You say, putting aside the revolutionary expectation of liberationist thought and practice, and let's focus on rest or the more mundane elements by which someone might imagine their liberation is an easy life, right? Free from violence, all of these things. I want to challenge you to believe that those two things are the same. That revolution as a kind of aesthetic of liberatory politics contains those elements of the everyday. Right? And there's plenty of evidence, certainly in the cultural realm, to demonstrate that, but also to think about how those things might be actually one and the same in the practice as you see it playing out in your communities?
Thank you so much. This is a very great comment, and I'll start with the second, the challenge that you've given me. And actually, it reminds me of the question that I asked you about your paper last week, when I asked about what is it that people are running from and running towards. And I think that that is basically sort of a hint at what you're trying to challenge me to think about, and that the language. So for me, using that, or sort of, alluding to that, was because I felt that there was a lot that needed to be unpacked there. And while I see myself as an anthropologist now, I also, am a humanist in that way, because, or in many ways, by training and also by disposition. And so I'm not just thinking about data in terms of the numbers or the quantifiable numbers that one would sort of analyze that this is what this is about and hence that's what it is, but looking at how it is that people, not just in terms of the figures, but how it is that people respond when they are in certain circumstances. And I think that that's what you're trying to make me see, and I do agree with you. The idea that people don't feel lied to, and that they feel that they have instead been born into a dystopia is true, because, and this is where I think that there's a generational shift between those whose parents emigrated to the US and have lived here, and those who were born here as Africans and have become Africans, full stop, Americans. And then you see that for them, the idea of being born in America sort of establishes to them that they are supposed to be American. And I think that this is what Malcolm X was saying, that why would you, if you were really an American by birth, why would you need changes in the Constitution? We already see what is being pushed in the court systems in America, and how it is basically shaving off gradually the freedoms that African Americans had fought decades, albeit one could even say a century, to accomplish and attain. And so, I do agree that people, the sort of language with which people articulate these things, for those African full stop American who now travel back or relocate back to the continent, it's for them, in a sense, to, as it were, the language they use sometimes is to find themselves, to reconnect with their roots. That is for those whose parents perhaps completely severed that connection, or for some of them to attain to the full measure of their capabilities and their talents. So there are many ways with which they articulate these things. And that's also what I want to understand, how African Americans sort of verbalize these desires. How do they, articulate them when they move from Africa, I beg your pardon, America, to places in Europe or places in Africa. So that's how I want to situate my work. But thank you so very much for your comment. I appreciate it.
This is your friendly neighborhood art historian, who very much outside of the realm of what I do in thinking about methodologies and such. And so I think that's actually one of the questions that I was most interested in, since this is a work in progress, and you are in the process of collecting your data. I'm curious both about what primary methods you want to use, but also what constitutes evidence for you. Like, I saw your TikTok and your film clip, and what brought this to mind was actually the work of a colleague of mine, which I feel like is both very different, but has some similarities in terms of the way that you're approaching things. Sabia McCoy-Torres, who does multi-sited ethnographic work, but is also looking at the ways in which, primarily for her, Afro-Caribbeans in Brooklyn and in Costa Rica are developing like a sense of identity and a sense of placemaking that is both rooted in a sense of geography, but also does not conform to conventional ideas about geographic space, and the kind of continuities that you were noticing between African Americans and Africans, and this idea of deep fatigue brought that up for me, particularly in the idea of popular culture, which is, and so your use of TikTok and the film kind of brought that to mind for me. So I'm curious about like what things you're interested in pursuing to kind of to provide evidence for the things that you have already observed, or deeper evidence. And relatedly, I'm curious about what you see as the kind of theoretical contours of this project. I think also related to the last two questions, in terms of kind of like how far you want to push it in terms of theory and concept. And part of this has to do with, and this is gonna seem super far-fetched, but thinking about, I guess the ways in which, like you're talking about where Japa meets Blaxit, and there may not be this like this space where people can truly experience an emancipated sense of self, and the ways in which even historically the idea of unfreedom for African Americans was purposely connected in some ways to African geographic space. And like the example I'm gonna use is Angola Prison, which was built on the site of Angola Plantation and actually a number of other plantations that were given African place names. And so it just has always been really like striking to me, the idea that even if you like ran away, unfreedom, like Africa was fundamentally connected to sites of unfreedom here, and like Catherine McKittrick's ideas about Black folks being rendered kind of like geography-less. And so I guess I'm thinking about this theoretical, like even in a theoretical space, like can we create a theoretical space where Black freedom can really exist, and is that a kind of transnational space, and what does it mean that there is no physical geography where that can be experienced? And so that probably came out all jumbled, but there's a cogent thought in there somewhere.
There are many cogent thoughts. Thank you so very much. Like, honestly, I must confess, this is the first I've heard of non-freedom sites that have African names, or that are named according to African countries. This is...
Like, even if you go to the place it's supposed to be home, it's like a site of...
It's a site of non-freedom, and they are prisons. And so the idea that in the mind of those global, of those oppressive structures, in its mind, even the notion of Black freedom must be completely contained. Not something that, the name itself, because if it's called Angola and it's a prison, it becomes a site that reinforces the idea that Black people cannot attain to complete and absolute freedom. This is how I'm understanding it in the initial terms. But thank you. I think this is something that I would have to look into more deeply, especially with respect to how it may perhaps enable us to better understand how Japa may meet Blaxit. When you speak or ask questions about the theoretical contours of this project, there are many things that I'm thinking about utilizing as the theoretical framework for examining how Japa meets Blaxit. because the central kernel of my study is to look at the concept of flight vis-a-vis forced, voluntary, whatever else in between immobility. And obviously, it's not just immobility that is caused by different, I'm not just situating it only about immobility and not just talking about flight, but also migration writ large. Because we need to, we shouldn't forget that there are people who are actually relocating just because they want to relocate. And not because they're feeling, let me rephrase that, they're relocating because they have the capacity to relocate, not because they're feeling the immediate, as it were, strains of these different oppressions. And by that I mean Africans who are moving out of America, or African, full stop Americans who are moving from out of America to Africa, because they have the means to do so, as the gentleman here made us to see. So I would be situating the work within frameworks of theoretical landscape of immobility, liberation, emancipation, flight, and all conversations, scholarly conversations around stockedness, while also expanding it to perhaps the liberatory sort of visions that people have discussed on what Black freedom actually means, and those sorts of things that, you know, have been marshaled as arguments about the everyday aesthetic as a methodology for claiming and reclaiming you know, freedom for oneself. In discussing also the multi-sited ethnographic work, and to whom I would be, my interlocutors would be, I have this vision of not just taking material to sort of do a historical reading of Japa and Blaxit, but also to utilize these different social media platforms that have all these different small and large ecosystems, to study them and to conduct interviews with these different individuals who run some of these businesses that enable people to migrate, you know, cross-continentally or transnationally or whichever. So those would be my interlocutors, and those are the people with whom or from whom I will derive ethnographic data. Nevertheless, it will be situated, because obviously if you're going to discuss a continuum of displacement, it began somewhere, or at least it references some other thing that has happened in the past. So definitely historical material will ground the work before I obviously utilize ethnographic material. Huh? What you say?
If you need introduction, I'm happy to.
Oh, thank you.
For Tastemaker Africa and Black and Abroad.
Oh, there's so many of them, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it. There's so many of them. There's something I saw that was called Blaxit Global, and it's actually a name, Blaxit Global, and you can sort of join their network, and they can supply you with enough, at least my understanding, with information about places that you can relocate. And it's not just relocating to Africa, by the way. It's also relocating to... Huh?
Costa Rica is
Indeed. There are people who are relocating to Mexico, you know, who are like, I don't want to be too far away from family, because just the idea of uprooting oneself, you're basically, it can be you know, that's what I was trying to say. It can be a little unsettling, even though it also sort of can be inspiring to do so. I remember watching a video, I just could not remember their name on YouTube, but this African-American family relocated with their kids, actually, to Ghana. And this woman basically walks people through her different day-to-day life experiences with her family, etc. And one of the things that she had shared in the past of the videos that I saw was her kids talking about when she was asking them, like, what do you miss? And they'll be like, I miss the food. And the mother would be like, but don't you like the fruits and blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh yeah, the fruits here are more delicious. And they would talk about like the things that they miss, the things that they do not miss. And then she would ask the same question of her husband as well, about the things that he misses or the things he does not miss. But one thing that I found to be almost like a constant refrain was the fact that they could heave, like they could sort of breathe they could take a breath way down to their stomach. Like almost like and this, I'm not quoting them verbatim, but that is the idea that I got from the different videos that they had shared. It's just unfortunate that I could not remember their name. And obviously, if you could do a Google search, African-American family that travels, there's several of them. But I remember the impression that I derived from watching their videos, because in watching their videos, I was able to see that they could actually take a deep breath all the way to their stomach, like they could breathe, they could really breathe. And so for me, I was like, what does that say? While I was thinking about this study, what does that say about what liberation means? It's not just dignity, it's also just this idea, this very, as it were, seeming mundane activity of breathing, and breathing all the way to, not just the chesty breath, but breathing all the way to your stomach,
Thank you for your presentation. When I look at your poster, I'm reminded of kind of this emblem of the Great Migration here in America. And that also reminds me of a digital humanities project that the Schomburg Library supports called In Motion. It's a great project that maps multiple migrations of Black people in the United States before and after kind of this moment of the Great Migration. And so that led me to think of how you might spatially represent your data through mapping, through digital mapping, through a digital humanities project, and what would be the benefits of visualizing the movement in a variety of ways, and how might you map virtual communities that you discussed as well, so that maybe it's not a full book, but maybe it's a robust digital humanities project supported by your scholarship and research.
Can I just look in this direction and say, I'm sorry to say this, but I have to say, you heard the question, right? So she's talking about support for the project, just in case. Yes, you see? Thank you for mentioning that. So. But thank you for this. I wanted to ask a question because I didn't quite get what she said the name of the project was.
It's called In Motion.
In Motion.
And
okay.
It's the Schomburg Center in Harlem. It's part of the New York Public Library System. It's an excellent platform. I've used it in secondary education classrooms. I've used it with undergraduate students. They provide primary source materials, secondary source materials, and you can see the different migrations, throughout the, I guess from Emancipation all the way up to the 1970s. And I'm not sure if they've expanded it, but this certainly might be something that would expand and connect to that robust research that they have.
Thank you. So to your question, how will I spatially map this project? That was also something I thought that I had to contend with. Obviously, due to familiarity, I'm gonna consider Nigeria because it's home, it's my country, and perhaps expand from Nigeria to West Africa to talk about these things. But while I was doing this study, I thought, okay, what would sort of inspire or inform or drive young and not so young Africans to move north to south, east to west, within and across the continent, and be outbound or out-migrate to other places. And so I think that perhaps the way that I might be able, because I'm still trying to sort of figure out, even though I know that the catchment of interlocutors would be, for the most part, virtual, because I would be, interfacing with these different people who manage all these different virtual communities and platforms, how to sort of navigate east to west, north to south would be something that I have to sort of break down, in a very intentional and very material way. Because then, while I'm trying to sort of derive data, I need to understand, because I would not want to think, while there's a universality, I still think that there might be certain reasons why people in North Africa move and where it is that they would move to. People in Algeria or from Algeria move mostly to France and then other places, obviously for language reasons. People in Angola move to Portugal, obviously for language reasons and perhaps for other reasons. And so not just the first thing that crosses my mind because Angolans speak Portuguese or Algerians speak, French or whatever else. I would want to sort of ensure that I have a good understanding and maybe use certain countries within these different geographical areas within the continent and use that to sort of understand what is inspiring or informing migration across to these different places or within Africa. Now, where I feel may be a little challenging for me might be understanding the African-American sort of experience of emigration. And while, it might be easy to say that the African-Americans who move, they are inspired to move or they're driven to move because of that singular issue, of that singular weight of racism, who's to say that some of them are not moving for other reasons? Perhaps to find a man, perhaps to, who's to say? So I'm putting this as a set of things or criteria that would determine what it is that would inspire these different peoples to move, hence to really understand how Japa meets Blaxit.
Professor. Excellent presentation. I'm sorry I was late. I'm Jack Drury, college class of 71. I'm now a lawyer, journalist, educator, most important maybe United Methodist Christian. To your point, Blaxit Global is dedicated to educating, informing, empowering, and inspiring brothers and sisters of the African diaspora to pursue a life abroad. Now, at the risk, and I realize I'm at a Harvard presentation where often the questions are more complicated and exotic than the presentation. I will say that we have so much to think about, going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, whose statue was unveiled in Dublin this summer, to Dr. Du Bois dying in Ghana. I don't know if that's Josephine Baker there, but Josephine Baker in Paris, James Baldwin, our brother from here, Randall Robinson, dying, not really feeling he was an American. Myself, I lived in Tanzania. I was the co-director of the Harvard Africa Volunteer Project in 1971. My goddaughter lives in Tanzania now, doing Charles Stiss' program there. So anything you want to speak to with respect to that, Professor, because as African Americans, we have this on our minds almost every day when we look around the world and we see, well, maybe I could do more there.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate your comment. I must say, thank you for mentioning Frederick Douglass, by the way. For those of us who went to the excursion where we saw the curation at the museum on Frederick Douglass, I remember thinking while I was at the museum and then watching all the clips and then seeing all the items on display, I thought to myself, not to minimize this or to sort of be jocular, but I actually thought that if Frederick Douglass was born in this moment, he would be the premium influencer of his time. Because the man took, and he was very, very strategic. He took photos of himself for a reason. He wasn't just taking those photos because. I mean, obviously, perhaps there might be a string of, vainglory, because the man is a very good-looking man. But it was very strategic about how he presented himself and how he was using images, even in his own letters and his papers. It was very clear why he did what he did and why he invested both time and energy. As a matter of fact, I remember when Professor Gates was talking about the whole activity of taking a photo. I didn't realize that you had to have your back braced to sit upright. Because if you move, then the photo, right now we just have our phones and we could just, we take these things for granted. But he had to have his back braced so he can sit upright and look majestic and, have poise, such that even in old age, you realize that none of them is slouching. We just take photos and it's like, yeah, why you slouch? Okay, take another one. Okay, take another one, right? But at that time, you didn't have that. I mean, obviously, before you take another photo, you need to wait another 8 minutes, I believe. And so that must be extremely stressful. And so I admired the idea of an investment in not just image rendering, but in using that as not only a form of historicizing the Black experience, but of reclaiming Black personhood. So when you cite Blaxit and sort of what it means, your quotation as how people are taught. I didn't quite get that, but I think you mentioned how they pursue life abroad. I think that what Blaxit provides, even for those who are not planning actively to relocate, is that it provides the idea that this aspiration is valid, that you can actually take the steps if you want because the information is available. Imagine not knowing where your roots are and then feeling like you want to be in a place where you do not have to think about your Blackness. There was something, and there's a video, I have it somewhere, but I would have shared it, but I think in the interest of time, where Dave Chappelle mentioned that he was also going to go to Ghana. Because, why? He felt that the soul being, sorry, for some reason his name's just escaping my mind now. The artist, Stevie Wonder, yes, because Stevie Wonder is going to relocate. And he says, if the soul of America is relocating, what am I still doing here? And then he said something along the lines of, well, I know that Stevie Wonder's soul is definitely going to heaven, so why would I not want to be where Stevie Wonder's soul is going to be? I mean, obviously it's funny, but there's something to say about what he meant by the soul of America. There's so much to unpack within that, because Stevie Wonder captures a certain generation. Even the quote that I alluded to here, where he said, I do not want to have my children be asked, oh, like me, or I don't want them to think about that. I want them to be free, in a sense. He said, what is that? And that was an interview, a conversation he had with Oprah. And these are people, just like we have wealthy Africans or, upper middle class Africans who are able to move across and do not feel that they are encumbered by migratory policies, or even African, full stop, Americans who are moving across the continent. These are people who are, by all standards, very wealthy people. There was a video that was circulating Idris Elba, who also went to Ghana. And the way in which he spoke about his experience in Ghana is very similar to what Dave Chappelle said. He said that the air and everything was so welcoming. And that's the thing, that same thing about breath, being able to breathe all the way down to your stomach and what that means. Yeah. Oh, I think she has a question. Oh. Okay.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so very much.
Congratulations for
Oh,
the presentation.
thank
I didn't
you.
want to challenge with that because I think what was great is the way that you actually gave context and structure
Yeah.
to the migration. But I think what would be great in your work is the thing about people that move for aspiration. It's a lot.
Oh, it's a lot.
And me, the people I see in Nigeria, that all women, a lot of people left, and a lot of people actually went to the UK because they received visa.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. What's your name? Timothy. Oh, no, I know you.